So one discussion is about what kind of legal reform we need, and there might be possibilities now from this dilemma that that you're talking about. That obviously the centrist Democrats have done tons of stuff in the last few decades to undermine the bargaining power of major unions, etc. All of that's true. They're obviously beholden to the owning class, but they do have this contrary incentive because electorally they are really screwed if unions go away completely. So that the tension between those creates some possibility for legal reform. But you also talk about in your book and elsewhere, kind of like what different things unions could do to operate within the rigged and god-awful rules that currently exist. One of the most interesting one of which, and maybe for a lot of people the most counterintuitive, and you sort of you kind of referred to it in passing earlier, but I want to make this a little bit more explicit, is letting go maybe of seeking exclusive representation in every case, maybe embracing minority unionism as a strategy. So not, on purpose, not every, like you're not trying to have, what we would currently, in the United States, which is a crucial qualifier, in the United States, consider to be a union shop, where you have one union that's won the legal right to represent everybody there, that you actually think that there are benefits to not always pursuing that.
How into the weeds can I get here?
Medium.
Okay. Unions were organized in this country largely on an exclusive basis, but it was also on a basis of we, the union, are going to train the workers to do the job of forging steel, of electrician work, etc. And then you only can get workers from the union. That's in the DNA of unions. And so when the NLRB framework came around, where it was like, you get certified, a group of workers can say, we're a union, you have to bargain with us. And that really was what the NLRB was meant to say. There's 5 of us here. Even though there's 500 workers, there's 5 of us that want to be a member of this union. You have to bargain with the 5 of us. And so in the early days of the NLRB, it was certifying these sort of minority unions of like, there's 5 people say that they're members of the UAW. You got to bargain with those 5 people. And what happened is, again, partly there's this vestigial notion of like everybody should be in the union. Partly you had the fact that the AFL and the CIO were competing, and the AFL had a sort of an organizational strategy of every electrician should be ours, and every carpenter should be theirs, and every broom sweeper should belong to the broom sweepers union. And the CIO was like, no, like everybody that works for GM should be in the same union, General Motors. And they were doing jurisdictional fights in these competitive elections under the NLRB. And so the NLRB was Roosevelt's thing, and the CIO was very, was loyal to Roosevelt. And so the CIO started to want to get exclusive certifications in order to stop the AFL from saying, these 5 workers belong to us, and just carving up the bargaining unit and like dividing up the unit. And so they were getting it. And so then you had these exclusive units, but you didn't necessarily have agency fee or the union shop. You didn't have the principle that everybody had to join the union. But the unions were winning wage increases every year. So everybody was joining because like it was pretty sweet. It's like, thank you. Another $2, $2 an hour wage. Yeah, I'm joining. Then comes World War II. And the unions, out of a feeling of patriotism, commit to a no strike. We're not going to strike for the war because, the GM factories were now making bombs and bombers to defeat the Nazis. Yeah, we should probably build as many bombers as possible to kill as many Nazis as possible. That's probably a good thing for society. Right. But then Roosevelt's War Labor Board froze wages, and you had workers that were dealing with factory lines that were getting sped up, inflation, because inflation was going crazy during the war, and no ability to strike. And their only form of protest was to quit the union in protest. And so the unions were dealing with this devastating loss of dues revenue and membership. And they were pleading with the War Labor Board, like, you gotta fix this for us, or else we're gonna have to give up the no strike, agreement. And the War Labor Board created this formula called maintenance of membership, which is basically contract is signed. Everybody who's a member today has to stay a member for the rest of the contract, which evolved into agency fee and union shop. And so that's where we're at in terms of what a union is. And so today most contracts have a no strike clause, which is basically a contract term of year, 5 years, 7 years, starting to get longer and longer, that says, like, these are the wage increases, this is our arbitration process, this is the grievance process, and if you have a grievance, you take it to the grievance process, but there will be no strikes. And has a very fairly all-encompassing management's rights clause that lets the boss make a lot of fairly substantial decisions about, like, subcontracting or whatever. And in my experience, organizing new unions where, like, this is all still sort of de facto, like the boss is going to expect a management's rights clause and an arbitration clause, and that's what we're trading for a union shop clause or an agency fee clause. I have seen way too many. Look, it's very hard to get a strike wave going in this country. It's very hard. If workers need to see other workers go out on strike and be inspired by them going out on strike and winning, or even not winning but still getting their job back. And so you've got 10% of the workforce that has a union but are locked up by these clauses that say you can't go on strike. And worse than that is that I have seen so many wildcat strikes in, like, tiny units of, teachers districts, charter schools, whatever, where, like, the boss does something completely outrageous and the workers rightly are like, we're not coming in today. And the staff rep needs to show up and say, they can fire you, you got to go back to work.
Yeah, they're legally obligated to do that.
They're legally obligated to do that.
In fact, this
devastating.
is
it's devastating.
Yeah, we had in the book you have a really remarkable example of that from 4 years ago, from the inauguration of Donald Trump.
Oh yeah, the Rockettes. Yeah, the Rockettes did not want to dance in their short dresses for the pussy grabber in chief, and so a bunch of them refused to do it, and their union had to put out a press release saying you have to do this or you're fired. At the same exact time that the taxi drivers, who under the law are not technically workers, don't have a union contract, were striking, at the airports over, the threatened Muslim ban. And that was the contrast. It was terrible. It was really embarrassing. Like, it's just so defeatist. If you're like a non-union worker for, like, why should I join a union? Here's a group of workers that don't technically have a union, and they're going on strike. Here's a group of workers who are having a fairly reasonable objection to not tap dancing for a rapist. And they're the ones that are being told by their union leaders, you got to go back. And so one of the things that I'm pointing to is that this is only exclusive representation makes this possible. Because what makes the union responsible for enforcing the no strike clause is the fact that the union, it represents everybody, and everybody's got to belong to the union, or at least they're bound by the contract. And if you peel that back and you go back to what the NLRA was meant to do, which was to certify a members-only union, I'm only bound by this contract if I sign up with this union, then you create these really interesting possibilities where maybe another group of workers forms some other kind of union to do a temporary protest to say we're not going to tap dance for Donald Trump. And they're not bound by the no strike clause any longer.
Yeah, and you and look, there's a lot more we could say about that. I think as you'd be the first to acknowledge, there are advantages and disadvantages to this approach that you're talking about. But another point that you've made to me, and you make in the book, is actually odd little bit of ideological convergence. Is the same point that Thaddeus Russell made here a few weeks ago, which is that there is some historical evidence that non-exclusivity, having to compete for members with other unions, has in some cases been an incentive to engage in more militant tactics to bring home the goods for workers. So I think there's a lot more that we could say about that, but I want to move on to a couple of other things. Do you have like another 20 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
All right, cool.
So on that, I don't want to say like I'm a cockeyed. I'm not like, this is the way to the right. Like it's not. Like I'm pointing to like a crazy sci-fi experiment here, and like my friend Chris Brooks from Labor Notes, he's always quick to point out that like unions, like public sector unions, compete in Tennessee, and it only leads to like more conservative union strategies. And that's true. And like, I'm pointing to like these crazy experiences out of like 1934 in the hotels where like there was a Trotskyite union, there was an anarchist union, there was a communist union, and there was a mobster union. And like, it's not even like we're comparing apples and oranges. We're comparing like chopped, ground beef and cucumbers. It's so bizarre. But I do think what it creates is some opportunity for a little bit more of a rank and file rebellion. And we just need more of that in the air, because and here's what I'd say: if the bosses are determined to break the basic elements of labor peace, and labor peace depends upon exclusive representation and agency fee and no strike clauses and all that, but Janus is them saying like, no, we're not interested. It really does beg a couple of people saying like, we'll show you what the lack of labor peace means. And that's more of the left strategy. I'd really much rather do this in like auto factories in Detroit than public schools in Tennessee.
Yeah, fair enough. Joined by current affairs editor Nathan Robinson. Shaun, do you know Nathan?
I do not, no, but I know the name.
Hello, Shaun. Nice to meet you. I've just been looking up your book as I've been listening to you, because everything you've been saying has made me fascinated and want to read it. So I'm gonna get a copy right away.
Let's sell me 23 copies from your followers.
Should write some labor stuff for current affairs, but yeah. So there are a couple things that I wanted to talk about while you're both here. I want to talk about what has just been happening to Nathan in a few minutes. It's of course the primary reason that we invited him on, beyond always enjoying his presence and his commentary. But first, while you're both here, wanted to switch gears a little bit. Speaking of the lack of class peace, Forrest, do you want to set this up for us? The Indian farmers thing.
Yeah. So there's a really good description of it. I don't know if we really have time to watch it, but BJ Prashad was on Weekends yesterday on the Jacobin channel and did a really good kind of analysis of how this all got started. Basically, Modi has passed these 3 farmer bills in the name of like reform and progress, which obviously amounts to like a neoliberal crackdown on the fact that in places like Kerala, where farmers kind of rely on this, they have a minimum support price. So basically, the government will set a floor on how much each crop is worth. So if a crop isn't selling that well at the moment, the government will basically buy out farmers who don't manage to sell to bigger farmers, or to distributors. So Modi's farm bills basically would impact that and would make it so that, because this isn't codified into law, it's kind of just an agreement that the Indian government has with farmers and peasants, that they'll set this price usually. So there's a movement to codify that into law, and Modi's bills would basically do the opposite and would open up the free market so that there's no price limit, there's nothing. It's just that, you know, anyone can come in from the US or anywhere else and just say, hey, we don't want to pay this much for your crops like anymore, and basically give you nothing for them. So this set off a series of strikes, which ended up with workers and manufacturers, like these huge amounts of groups, 250 million people, striking, which is the big, 250 million. So it's 200. Yeah, no, it's the biggest strike in history that's ever been recorded.
Yeah, so not, and these are like small holding independent farmers,
Yeah.
that we're talking about here. So it's not a labor strike, but it's
labor has joined in solidarity. So Jacobin wrote a really good piece about it that I can pull up that kind of explains it. So workers began striking in other sectors. That's how it became such a big strike.
Yeah, so I mean, this is just worth worth noting and given at least a minute or two too, since this is kind of an astonishing thing that this is something that I think you could you could watch a lot of hours of cable news and spend a lot of hours reading the mainstream press and have no idea that this is going on, or maybe every now and again run into a passing mention of it.
Well, when it first happened, I checked which publications were covering it. Only really Jacobin, Common Dreams, and like the progressive press in the U.S. was covering it. Like, and now they've started covering it because you really can't you can't ignore it. But the Indian government has been cracking down on journalists and basically have raided even like journalists, like the homes of journalists, to try to get information about before they could publish it. Hold on, I'm going to pull up the Vijay Prashad thing really fast. It's a couple minutes because he really explains it a lot better.
Yeah. All right. So let's watch just a couple minutes of Vijay Prashad. Give Nathan and Shaun a chance to weigh in, and then we'll switch gears to the original subject.
There's a long-standing dynamic in capitalism that erodes the ability of farmers and agricultural workers to make a living. This is a long history. So let's not forget that history. It's been a very long struggle for farmers and agricultural workers to survive against the entire profit system, not just what's happening in India today. This long-term problem is what provoked in the United States, for instance, the suicides during the farm consolidations, the monopoly control of farms in the 1980s. You might remember the Farm Aid concerts in the United States and so on. This is a very long-term issue that I'd just like to have us put on the table. More closely in terms of India, last year, in the middle of the pandemic, the Indian government, the extreme right government led by Narendra Modi, Prime Minister Modi, pushed through 3 farm bills and 2 labor bills, all basically along the lines of the International Monetary Fund's so-called, rationalization, liberalization policy. In terms of the labor bills, it's called basically, there's a kind of labor rationalization that's needed. What they mean is, of course, labor needs to be defeated. These farm bills are very, very much an attack on farmers and on agricultural workers in the following 2 ways at least. Firstly, they allow big corporate entities to enter and to come in and dominate the marketplace, the mandi, where the small farmers, medium farmers bring their goods to sell. So there is this issue of who controls the mandi. Secondly, the Food Corporation of India, the FCI, which used to have a commanding role in the mandi, in this marketplace, would come in, would buy, the product brought to the market by the small farmers, medium farmers, and so on. And by doing this, the Food Corporation of India did two simultaneous things. On the one side, it enabled a floor price for the farmers. If there was insufficient demand for the farmers' products, the Food Corporation would buy up, whatever they were selling and ensure that there was a minimum support price for them in terms of their incomes. On the other,
that's the beginning kind of just explaining the floor price thing, which is what I wanted to bring up. More than the strike itself, just kind of as part of the same subject of what could be done without. I mean, in certain places, what could be done without necessarily passing something like the PRO Act and without necessarily relying on unions. It's an interesting example that that doesn't exist here, but it's an example of something that that can be done to help out farmers and laborers.
So are you just kind of thinking in terms of like wildcat strike outside of official channels, or you want to spell out the connection a little bit more you were thinking of?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is. It's the biggest wildcat strike ever. You know what I mean? Like in history that's ever been recorded, because it's like it's been huge, and I think he explains it later on in that clip. But yeah, that was kind of the connection.
All right. So I do want to switch gears in a minute, but either of you guys have anything you want to add?
I sort of lost track of Indian politics a while ago. It also just got really depressing as it went further in a sort of Hindu nationalist direction. I used to organize a lot of Indian workers in higher ed, postdoctoral research associates, and I love them. It was almost like a reminder of it was like an echo of dealing with like Cuban folks, where it's like you're either here or there. It was just totally polarized, and particularly a lot of folks coming out of Uttar Pradesh, which is this state in India that like sort of routinely elects communist governments, where like 9 out of 10 of the Indian scientists that I would organize would be like, give me that card. When are we going on strike? And then there was this one that would be like, oh no, the union's ruined my dad's life. You don't understand. It's like, well, I think I know why they ruined your dad's life, and I'm not sure I'm sympathetic. But it's sort of really tragic to see the directions that things have moved in India. Once upon a time, I felt like India was this model for like moving towards a sort of, secularist, multi-ethnic democracy, and instead it's like pre-Trumpist.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly true that I share Shaun's kind of depression. It's in the direction of Indian politics, considering that and considering this example of this vibrant tradition of the Indian left and of resistance. But as Forrest was saying, one of the things that strikes me about this is that as a person who's always thinking about media and runs a small outlet, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is just how non-existent coverage of vastly important global stories is in the American press. I mean, Americans are essentially the rest of the world doesn't exist in the American press. It's not real. Occasionally, if something truly catastrophic happens, it gets 2 minutes. But it really is the case. I mean, we know there have been studies that have sort of shown the value of a life by country in the American press. But I don't think we necessarily notice that there's actually been a real serious change. Like CNN, for example, they either completely shut down CNN International or they gutted CNN International, which used to be a serious part of their operation was international news. But of course, it turned out that people wanted to watch Donald Trump. So because they want to watch Donald Trump, because they don't want to hear about Indian politics, they're never going to find out that. I mean, it's almost worse with coverage of, for example, Mexico, where things that are 10 feet on the other side of the U.S. border are treated as non-existent. And this is hundreds of millions of people involved in something hugely consequential for global politics, and the U.S. publication that's covering the most is Jacobin. A small socialist bi-monthly, right? It's really just such a disgrace.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I'm glad you devoted a few minutes to it.
Even like Al Jazeera got gutted and moved to like a mostly online service, which I think for a long time people got most of their international news from there at different times. Like, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.